I went back and forth and debated on whether or not to make this video because the last thing we should be doing right now is coming to the Bulls front office defense based on their decision-making, track record, and resume since taking over the team in 2020. And I'm also fully aware that there are going to be a lot of people that disagree with this take and will go nuclear on me in the comments. And look, if you've been following the channel for a while, I've given my share of fair criticism of the Bulls front office and how they've handled this team in the last couple of seasons, but I've been seeing this narrative going around for some time now. A very calculated agenda and some extreme revisionist history that portray AK to be the worst executive in basketball and why he should have been fired a long time ago. And while I am all for throwing fair criticism at AK, especially for some of the poor decisions he's made over the years, I do think there is a difference between justified criticism and extreme negativity and blatant hating without context. And I'm sure some of you are probably saying, well, what the hell do you mean by that? Well, let me explain further in this video, and I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the matter as well. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, of course, we've been hearing our fair share of criticism and hating on AK really since the end of that 21-22 season. Well, I've agreed with some and disagreed with others on their assessment of AK. I've come to realize that one of the things that bothers me most when it comes to basketball discourse and trying to have an intelligent debate is this concept of revisionist history, revising history, exaggerating the truth so that it fits your agenda. I mean, one of the biggest things people struggle with, myself included, is admitting when you're wrong, when a take you had years ago turned out to be wildly incorrect, or your hate for a certain player, coach, or GM is so strong that even when they do something well, you'll always choose to focus on the negative. This by no means that I'm immune to this, we all fall victim to it. But based on some of the things I've seen being thrown around about the Bulls front office, more specifically AK and their assessment of Josh Giddey and the Caruso trade, has got me to the point where I do think it's necessary to clear some things up, provide some actual context and history that I feel people have slowly started to forget. Now, this whole thing came about, and why I decided to address this in more detail was after I saw a tweet from SB Nation's Ricky O'Donnell, who, by the way, does great work. I really respect what he does. He's an incredible basketball mind and is one of the best analysts when it comes to assessing NBA draft prospects. And I know this is going to come off as if I'm calling out Ricky specifically, but it's really more of a representation of what I've seen across all Bulls fans and even some in the media, like Ricky as well, who generally speaking are supposed to be more objective and unbiased in their reporting. But here's the tweet from Ricky O'Donnell that calls out all of AK's mistakes over his tenure, which again, I see this from a lot of people calling out these transactions specifically. Ricky, by the way, he later deleted this tweet, but in it he cites AK's greatest hits: disastrous Vuce trade, whiffed on the number 4 pick, overpaid Lavine, held on to a mediocre core way too long, got pantsed in the Caruso Giddey trade. He also later added in a separate comment about the Bulls letting Lauri Markkanen go and only getting a measly lottery-protected first-round pick that is likely to never convey. Now, while there is truth to a lot of this, and the Bulls front office, specifically AK, need to take accountability for some of these blunders, I do think it's fair and worth providing some context, historical context that I feel has often been forgotten in the Bulls fans' frustration with this new regime and the current state of this team. So let's go through it bullet point by bullet point. First off, the disastrous Vucevic trade. I think we can all agree that the Vuce trade, in hindsight, was bad. It did not work out. They mortgaged their future by trading 2 first-round picks and Wendell Carter Jr. for a player who, while he's shown up well this season, hasn't been that great and clearly was not worth 2 first-round picks, 2 lottery picks, I might add. And you look at the Orlando Magic now and see how they have one of the brightest young cores, and you think, yeah, the Bulls screwed up big time. Here's the thing that people don't remember. When the Vucevic trade happened, most people, I'm not saying everyone, but most people were praising the deal, praising the trade for this new front office actually making a big splash and acting like a big market franchise. For the first time in a long time, they had executed a trade for an all-star. Because yes, Vucevic was an all-star at the time of the trade. And people don't remember, going into the trade deadline, despite the Bulls still building out their young core of Lavine, Markkanen, Wendell Carter Jr., and Coby White, Bulls fans were begging for a trade, begging for some change. And the two biggest things we wanted at that time was a center, a starting center, and a starting point guard. Because again, at that time, Wendell Carter Jr. and Coby White were not cutting it. There was actually a period where they were playing so poorly that they got benched by Billy Donovan, and he opted to start Thaddeus Young at the 5 and bring Tomas Satoransky back in the starting lineup at point. So while people will say, well, they should have never given up on that young core and accelerated the timeline to win now by trading for Vucevic and bringing in DeMar DeRozan, a lot of Bulls fans did not like that young core. And that young core was not meeting expectations. And so when the new front office came in and said, yeah, we've assessed this group, they're not good enough. We're going to make adjustments and show that we mean business in trying to compete. We're going to go out and get a big name. People loved it. As much as many of you will deny it now, a lot of people praise the Vucevic trade, and I remember because I had the channel at that time and was making videos on it. And here's the other thing, a lot of people like to talk about how, well, trading for Vucevic in a vacuum wasn't so bad. It's more the fact that they overpaid for him, that he wasn't worth 2 first-round picks, and one of those picks obviously would eventually become Franz Wagner. Vuce at the time of the trade was averaging 24 and 12 on 40% shooting from 3 on high volume at 3-point rate. He was one of the more efficient big men in the NBA in his prime. When you look at the landscape around the league and see what other guys were fetching on the trade market, fringe all-stars, DeJounte Murray getting 3 first-round picks at a later time, Rudy Gobert 4 first-round picks, Mikal Bridges most recently getting 5 first-round picks, then yes, Vucevic having the best season of his career and all-star was most certainly worth 2 first-round picks. And let's also be real, if one of those picks didn't become Franz Wagner, this trade wouldn't look so bad. And you have to remember, by the Bulls, when they made that trade, the expectation was when you get a player like Nikola Vucevic, the Bulls are now going to be on this winning trajectory, that they would be a playoff team, and those picks they were sending to Orlando were going to be mid to late first rounders, not lottery picks. Now, as far as the Bulls whiffing on the number 4 pick, meaning drafting Patrick Williams, number 4 overall in 2020, what I'll say is this. Outside of Tyrese Halliburton and Tyrese Maxey, who went 12th and 21st overall respectively, so not even in the ballpark of a range where the Bulls were selecting, and also just goes to show you how a lot of teams passed up on those guys, not just the Bulls. But outside of that, who else could the Bulls have taken where you say, yeah, that guy was worth the number 4 overall pick in a fairly weak draft class? Here are the guys that were immediately drafted right after Pat. Isaac Okoro, Onyeka Okongwu, Killian Hayes, Obi Toppin, Denny Avdia, and Jalen Smith, who is now on the Bulls. Those were the players that rounded out the top 10. Outside of maybe Denny Avdia or Isaac Okoro, those would be the only players in hindsight I would have preferred to draft over Patrick Williams. And it's not like either of those guys are even close to being franchise-level players. So we can go on and on about how the Bulls whiffed on this pick, how Pat is a bust. It was a weak draft class when you actually look at the draft from top to bottom. If this was a stacked draft where so many of the players drafted right after Pat became All-Stars already, that would be one thing. But some of the guys that went in the lottery aren't even in the league anymore. Some are bouncing around from team to team and barely getting any playing time. Now, how about this notion that the Bulls overpaid for Zach Lavine? And look, you guys know, I've always been a little more on the critical side of Zach, and I was not a fan of the Bulls giving him a max contract. I made countless videos talking about it at that time, but I also acknowledged, and will still acknowledge, that the Bulls were in a bird rights trap. What else were they going to do in the summer of 2022 with Zach Lavine? Now, if it was the summer of 2023, it would have been a different story because it was clear by then that this core wasn't going to work. But in 2022, the Bulls were coming off that great start to the season where they were the number 1 seed but then fell off after Lonzo got injured. And because the Bulls thought that he was coming back to start the 22-23 season, they wanted to keep their core together to see if they could replicate what they had before he got injured. The Bulls weren't going to let Lavine walk in free agency because even if they did that, they were already over the cap. So it's not like they would have just freed up a bunch of cap space by letting Lavine go to another team. They had his bird rights, so it made more economical sense to re-sign him and then figure it out later. And then paying Lavine anything less than the max just would have soured the relationship and would have been a bad look on the Bulls for being cheap and not paying, I should say, their star what he deserved. Like, as much as I didn't want it to happen, I knew there was no scenario where the Bulls weren't going to pay Zach Lavine a max contract. They had backed themselves into that situation and were in a bird rights trap, very similar to the situation with Nikola Vucevic a summer later. Now, the Bulls hanging on to this mediocre core for too long, that is 100% right. And that's honestly the biggest gripe I have with this front office is that they should have seen this group was not going to work. They should have known that even if Lonzo was going to come back, which again, they should have seen based on his recovery that it was unlikely, but that this group, this core, simply put, was not good enough. And instead of doubling down, preaching continuity, being too prideful to admit defeat, they should have ripped off the band-aid earlier and made changes. But multiple trade deadlines, multiple off seasons, they never made any changes, and that is the biggest blemish on their resume. That said though, Lonzo Ball getting injured really threw a wrench in this whole thing they were trying to build, because even though I don't think the Bulls would have won a championship with that core, they were a pretty damn good team with Lonzo. Lonzo being the glue that put everything together and what made the engine run. I just think AK got a little too married to that idea and should have reacted sooner when it was clear that Lonzo wasn't going to be coming back anytime soon. Now, finally, the Giddey trade. I feel like I've already said my piece on this, so I won't belabor the point here. Yes, the Bulls should have gotten more in that trade deal, knowing all the picks the Thunder have at their disposal, and knowing Caruso was their most valuable trade piece. And yes, so far, early returns haven't been great, but in my view, it's still too early to be making claims like this that the Bulls got fleeced in that deal. A lot of it is going to depend on who Josh Giddey becomes as a player. I do have major concerns and doubts that he's going to be a foundational piece that the front office believes he's going to be. and I do worry they're going to overpay him, but it's too early. It's been 18 games into this Josh Giddey era, if you want to call it that. The Bulls traded a 30-year-old for a 22-year-old who is an already established player instead of a late first-round pick that may have never amounted to anything. Give it some time and see where it goes. Oh, and then the thing I'll say about, the Lauri Markkanen deal real quick, because of course everyone now likes to talk about how the Bulls should have kept Markkanen and clearly derailed his career. Let's not act like how in the summer of 2021, when the Bulls were making all of these moves like landing Lonzo, Caruso, DeMar, that Lauri Markkanen was nothing more than an afterthought. And how most Bulls fans were down and out on Lauri, as was the rest of the league, I might add, given Lauri was one of the last free agents to sign with the team that summer, with cap space having all but dried up. When the Bulls executed a sign and trade for him with the Cavs, and the Bulls ended up getting Derrick Jones Jr. and a first-round pick in the deal, I remember at that time being shocked the Bulls were able to snag a first-round pick in that trade deal for a player no one really wanted. And yeah, everyone now says, well, it was a useless first-round pick and will likely never convey because it's a lottery-protected pick. At that time, there was no indication that the Blazers were going to pivot and go on a rebuild. They were still trying to win. Dame was still there. They still had CJ McCollum. They had Carmelo Anthony, who was having a revival in his career. Like, you would have thought the Blazers are for sure going to make the playoffs in the upcoming season, and the Bulls would get that first-round pick. But injuries to Dame, Blazers trading McCollum, falling short of expectations, and it just never happened. And yeah, now it likely will never convey, because I believe it's lottery protected until 2027, and then it becomes a second-round pick. So anyway, I get why fans are frustrated. I don't think AK is the right man for this job based on some of the decisions he's made and how he's handled things, but I also don't like how people tend to revise history and the extreme negativity because of an agenda they are trying to push. I know a lot of people won't agree with this. They'll probably think I'm crazy for even putting out a piece like this that defends AK and his actions, but I just thought it was necessary to remind folks how we got here. So let me know what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.